Hello, welcome back. I hope everyone's having a great week. We're halfway done with it, so I hope you are making the most out of whatever you're doing, whatever you can do in quarantine. But today we're going to talk about environmental racism, which is something I just became familiar with in probably like the last year. I was taking a social justice class spring 2019, and then I took an environmental advocacy class in the fall of 2019, and I learned about environmental racism and just the disparities, mostly racial disparities, class disparities, in regards to that. So I just want to talk about it because I know I really didn't know much about it like I said, up until a year ago, and I'm sure there's other people out there that are not entirely familiar with it. So just the most glaring example I think we can all point to is what's happening in Flint. That is a gross, like, negligence at a national scale. Everyone from around the country, I'm sure, knows more or less what's going on in Flint. And that is more than environmental racism at this point. That is a human rights crisis. That has been 6 years. April 24th, 2020 marked 6 years. So, just to give like some background on that, because I know like a lot of people know like the overview of it, but just to give some details about it. The water crisis in Flint began in 2014 when the city switched its drinking water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River in a cost-saving move. Inadequate treatment and testing of the water resulted in a series of major water quality and health issues for Flint residents. Issues that were chronically ignored, overlooked, and discounted by government officials, even as complaints mounted. Foul-smelling, discolored, off-tasting water piped into Flint homes for 18 months, which was causing skin rashes, hair loss, and itchy skin. And the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, a state-established body, concluded that the poor governmental response to the Flint crisis was a result of systemic racism, as many issues in this country are a result of. Everything we can point to today when it comes to a disparity between communities or what have you, is usually a case of systemic racism. And environmental racism is not as black and white as what we are used to seeing when we talk about institutionalized and systemic racism. It's not police brutality. It's not the prison industrial complex. So it's a bit more difficult to like wrap your brain around it, like just like nail it down to something. So in this video, I just want to like just give a lesson about it. It's much more detailed than what I'm going to cover in this video. This video is not exhaustive about the issue, but I'm definitely going to go into some things. So black people are exposed, are about 1.5 more times. Black people are exposed to 1.5 more particulate matter than white people, and Hispanics had about 1.2 times the exposure of non-Hispanic whites. The study found that people in poverty had about 1.3 times more exposure than people above poverty. So as we see in America again and again and again, everything is along racial and class lines. Now we see in 2020 and then just in recent times, everyone's like, why is everything about race? Why is this about race? Why is everything about race? But didn't white people make everything about race first? Didn't we start limiting housing by race, education by race, just a quality life along racial lines? So now when it comes to 2020, or in just like the last 10 years, we'll say, when we can access this information digitally, and everyone's like, everything in this country is based around race, now people want to scream out, why is everything about race? Because that's the way you made it. So now we're going to unpack it. And so it also finds that for black people, the proportion of exposure is only partly explained by the disproportionate geographic burden of polluting facilities, meaning the magnitude of emissions from individual factories appears to be higher in minority neighborhoods. In Cleveland, where I'm from, we have this thing called the Steel Yard, which is this huge factory industrial plant, and it's placed just outside of, or like not even outside, just almost in the center of a community full of black people, full of black and brown people. And so with environmental racism, another example of institutionalized racism, it is written into policies and just business happenings that they can place their businesses here because these are low class. These are whatever the government will term them as. These people live in poverty. These people do this. These people do that. So we can just pollute their air and it won't matter because they're already poor. That's how the government has come to approach this issue. So it seems that anywhere that researchers look, there's more evidence of deep racial disparities, exposure to environmental hazards. In fact, the idea of environmental justice, or to the degree to which people are treated equally and meaningfully in the creation of human environment, was crystallized in the 80s with the aid of a landmark study illustrating wide disparities in sightings of facilities for the disposal of hazardous waste. Leaders in environmental justice movement have posited in places as prestigious and rigorous as the United Nations publications and numerous peer-reviewed journals that environmental racism exists as the inverse of environmental justice. When environmental risks are allocated disproportionately along the lines of race, often without the input of affected communities of color. So hazardous and polluting and just damaging facilities that emit these damaging chemicals are placed in the backyards of black people. This is basically written into the law that these companies are allowed to place their factories and their waste and the disposal of their waste in impoverished communities, which are full of black people. For the most part. And so, of course, that's by no mistake. That's why we're calling it environmental racism. That's why with Flint's finding, because Flint's population is 54% black. And so we see that anytime the environment or anytime any type of disaster or tragedy strikes black people, it is not handled with the same urgency or the same just care, the same human dignity as white people. And when Hurricane Katrina struck, black people were receiving anywhere from like $8,000 to $10,000 less for their homes and just anything that was destroyed compared to their white counterparts, because they claimed that that black people had lower home values. So you're receiving $10,000 less because your home value is worth $10,000 less, but that was a baseless claim. And so environmental racism, for the most part, just to give a more thorough definition before I continue, refers to institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic hazardous waste based upon race. And so environmental racism is caused by several factors, including intentional neglect, Flint, Michigan, Hurricane Katrina, stuff like that, the alleged need for receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and a lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. So these companies claim that they need their facilities and they need receptacles in these communities that are clearly affecting the people, that are clearly, like in Michigan with that water crisis, itchy skin, hair falling out, rashes, and with lead poisoning, as we see children of color are, I think, 2.5 times more likely to experience lead poisoning than white children. And of course that affects the growth of the child. So communities of color have a higher exposure rates to air pollution than their white non-Hispanic counterparts. A Yale University study found that non-Hispanic whites had the lowest exposure for 11 of the 14 pollutants monitored in the study. Meanwhile, Hispanics had the highest exposure rates for 10 out of the 14 pollutants, and African Americans had higher exposure rates than whites for 13 of the 14 pollutants. Some of the pollutants studied have been connected to asthma, cardiovascular issues, lung disease, cancer. For example, in a case in the Bronx in New York, found that individuals who lived close to noxious industrial facilities and waste sites were 66% more likely to be hospitalized for asthma. Significantly, these same individuals were 13% more likely to be people of color. And so, again, based along racial lines, we see white people across the board have the least exposure to these chemicals, the least exposure to just the emissions of these factories, because it's never placed in their communities. You're never going to find anything like that in Westlake, Ohio. You're never going to find anything like that in Beechwood. But guess where you are going to find it? You're going to find it on in the Steelyard. You're going to find it on West 14th, down in the inner city, where you are going to see a bunch of black and brown people. So we can throw our waste in their community and we can get away with it because the government has given them permission to. The corporation, the powers that be that exist above them has given them the permission to. So, as the definition I read said, it was intentional neglect. So if the government's turning a blind eye and everyone else is turning a blind eye, then this goes unchecked. And with environmental racism, it's easier to get by, to evade the people that are being affected by it, because if you don't know, then you don't know. Like, you have to know what you're even researching to get to the bottom of this. And when you think of the environment, you just think of everything around you. You think of, this is where I live. Like, I don't know that I'm breathing in toxic chemicals. I don't know that I'm breathing in lead. I just know that this is where I live. So it's very easy for this to go on for decades without ever being addressed, because people in these communities just don't have, maybe don't have the knowledge. Maybe some people do, but for the most part, they just don't have the knowledge of another instance of where they are being harmed and just killed, potentially, by their government. And like I said, it's easier for us to point to police brutality in the prison system when we talk about oppression and racism against people of color. But this is also a very, very important issue when it comes to just public health, when it comes to human rights. As I said, with Flint, this is now a human rights crisis. This is 6 years going. So review data collected over a 20-year time period found that more than half of the people who live within 1.86 miles of toxic waste facilities in the United States are people of color. So more than half. Like, as I just said before, I read that white people are across the board the lowest rates of exposure. More than half of the people who live near these just toxic facilities are people of color. And so lead poisoning disproportionately affects children of color. Children of color who live in urban areas are at the highest risk for lead poisoning caused by lead-based paint. A study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined that 11.2% of African American children and 4% of Mexican children are exposed by lead, compared to 2.3% of white children. 2.3 for white children versus 11.2 for black. So lead poisoning can result in a wide range of health problems such as anemia, seizures, and brain development issues. So now, not only do we have environmental racism, of course, affecting these children's lives, now we have it in their health. So now we have, as I said, this is now an entire public health crisis. And then couple it with these communities not having access to the most quality health care. So then people start dying, or people just go through their life with who knows what type of impairments that they were not able to get checked at 4, 5, 6, 10 years old, and now they're 30 years old living with this same issue. And so climate change, let's move on to that. Climate change disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color. The effects of climate change, such as extreme weather conditions, have devastating consequences for communities of color and low-income communities. These extreme weather events can displace residents and even cause death. as I mentioned with Katrina. In the aftermath of such disasters, efforts of city officials to rebuild communities of color in low-income communities are often inadequate compared to efforts to rebuild higher-income and white communities. So the effort, even when it's time to rebuild their community so they can move back to where they came from, the effort's not even there. So the housing that they're getting is not adequate. The schooling that they're going to re-enroll their kids in is not adequate. So nothing is meeting the standards of living. And perhaps the most powerful example of this inequity of communities of color is in New Orleans, affected by Hurricane Katrina. Black homeowners received $8,000 to $10,000 less in government aid than white homeowners due to disparities in housing values, which was claimed. In 2013, about 80% of the mostly black residents in the city's lower Ninth Ward had not returned to their community due to inadequate building efforts. So now, first they experience a whole natural disaster. Of course, I'm sure a lot of us can remember Katrina. I was about 6 years old when it happened. I know some of you were babies or not born yet. But anyways, just look up a picture of it, and you can see the devastation that New Orleans faced. And so not only are they dealing with that devastation, now when time has passed and maybe they're thinking they can go back to living their life, no, they can't, because the government's not going to put the same resources into rebuilding them as was put into Lily White Suburbiaville. So water contamination plagues low-income areas and communities of color across the nation. Flint is, like I said, the most glaring example, but I just saw a picture yesterday. It was Compton, California. The water was like, it looked like ginger ale was coming out of their tap. It looked like Verner's ginger ale. Just look up a bottle of Verner's ginger ale, and it looked like that was coming out of someone's tap. And so water contamination has largely affected children of color in rural areas, indigenous communities, and migrant farm worker communities. Give me just a moment. I emailed myself something that I wanted to bring up in this video about indigenous communities, because I know just with the pipelines and such that run through their communities, they are often victimized by this. So I sent myself this, and I'm trying to figure out exactly where I put it. Dakota Access Pipeline and Mountain Valley Atlantic Coast pipelines that carry oil and gas and contaminate land and water usually run through indigenous communities. So routes are strategically planned through indigenous lands in poor communities because people have less power to stop them. As I said before, people in these communities, when they think of their environment, they don't necessarily think of, this is the government's fault that I live in this polluted and just polluted and contaminated water environment. They don't necessarily have the wherewithal or just the knowledge on how to tackle this issue. Or they just don't have the agency, because they feel like where they live, they don't really have access to the city. Spatial justice, which is an entirely different thing that I might hit another video. But it's definitely fascinating if you want to look it up. It's called Spatial Justice. I learned it in a sociology class I just took. But just indigenous communities, communities of color, low-income communities, as I keep repeating, these communities are full of people of color, and then indigenous communities full of indigenous people, drastically, just strikingly more affected by the environment and by the negligence of the government's care for their environment than their white counterparts. And like I said, this video is not exhaustive, and I'm not going to cover everything that is to be talked about with environmental racism. I have one more thing I think I want to talk about, though, before I go. No, I think, one second. Okay, I think I actually sent myself the wrong thing, but just to knock out some of that awkward silence that was just in this video. Race, class, stuff like that is always the link when it comes to institutionalized racism in America. You can link any type of oppression, any type of just disparity in this country to those two, race and class, and those two have always pretty much been linked. Like I mentioned in the last video, black people, 29% of black people live in poverty compared to 9% of white people. So almost a third of the black population in America is in poverty. And so that's why when I say these communities, these black communities, are affected by the government's negligence of them, I mean, it just is. It's their class being inextricably linked to their race. And so that is just another, like I said, I wasn't going to go, like this video is not going to be exhaustive of the entire issue, but that is like a kind of in-depth rundown of where we stand with environmental racism and like the major points of it is what I was trying to get to. And yeah, so those are like the major points. Feel free to look up more, of course. Always educate yourself more about this. I did not hit everything. Feel free to ask me more. My Twitter is linked on the YouTube page, so you want to DM me, I'll get you an answer. Like if you don't know really how to go about looking it up, I'm always happy to educate myself more on things and in turn educate you. So I'll just leave it there for the day. Stay radical always. Stay loud, stay active, and just like I said, this is a more nuanced and more evasive pillar of institutionalized racism. So I encourage everyone to read up about it and just become more knowledgeable about it, because I'm learning more about it as we speak. Like I said, I've only been familiar with it for about maybe the last year, a little over a year now. And so, yeah, education is activism. Thank you.